Started. Okay, so this week's Parsha is Parshas Vayeishev. It begins on the Art Scroll Chumash on page 199 in the Stone Chumash. And it starts, Yaakov settled in the land of his father, sojourning in the land of Canaan. These are the chronicles of Yaakov. Yosef, at the age of 17 years old, was a shepherd with his brothers by the flocks, but he was a youth with the sons of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Yosef would bring evil reports with them about them to their father. Now Israel loved Yosef more than all his sons, since he was a child of his old age, and he made him a fine woolen tunic. His brothers saw that it was he whom their father loved most of all his brothers, so they hated him, and they could not speak to him peaceably. So a number of things about this I wanted to say. First of all, it says that these are the chronicles of Yaakov, Yosef. What about everyone else? Why is it specifically Yosef? So the commentaries say that Yosef was the son that he loved Yosef more than the other brothers. And he, in the commentaries say, Rashi brings that he saw himself in Yosef, that Yosef's life was very similar to his own, that they both were hated by their brothers. And many things that happened in Yaakov's life was mirrored in Yosef's. But the commentaries also say that at the end of last week's Parsha, if you remember, it went through the whole lineage of Esav and all his descendants and the chiefs that came out. And it did this, it was pretty long, but it was long in the sense that it was like a full parak of the full chapter of the Torah, like how many, like 20 or 40 some odd verses, where it deals with the history of Esav. Whereas when it comes to Yaakov, we start here. These are the sons of Yaakov, Yosef, and then it goes on with the story of Yosef for a number of entire parshias. And our sages compare it to somebody who's sifting through sand, looking for a drop pearl that you work through the sand and you throw it. You immediately, like you see the sand, you throw it out, you throw it out, you throw it out till you got the pearl, and then you look at it closely and enjoy it. And it's saying that with Esav, it just went through Esav's descendants very briefly, just in a number of verses. Whereas now that we get to Yaakov, when we get to Yaakov, we have the whole story of his life, the whole story of Yosef's life that takes up a long, close examination. Another thing I wanted to comment on is that the Parsha begins, Yaakov settled in the land of his father's sojournings. So the Klei Yakar asks that why doesn't it keep a consistent expression, that it should say either that Yaakov sojourned in the land of his father's sojourning or that Yaakov settled in the land that his father settled in? Why does he use a different verb for what Yaakov did than what his father Yitzchak did? So the Klei Yakar answers, he gives two answers that are very similar. There's just a nuance in the difference. And that is, the first answer he gives is that earlier in, where was it? I think it's beginning of Parshas Vayeishev. Where is it? No, it wasn't in Vayeishev. Where is it? It's in 26:1. I'll go back to there. It's in Parshas Toldos. On page 129. I'm looking at the wrong place. So it's in chapter 26, verse 3 on page 129. I'll back up to verse 2. It says, Hashem appeared to him, to Yitzchak, and said, do not descend to Egypt. Dwell in the land that I shall indicate to you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. So you see that the mitzvah that Hashem gave to Yitzchak was sojourn in this land. And that's what we see that it says about Yitzchak in the beginning of our parsha, the land of his father's sojourning, meaning he fulfilled that mitzvah of gur ba'aretz, sojourn in the land. That's why it's called ba'aretz megure, of the land of his father's sojourning. But our sages say the reason why Yaakov was punished in this parsha, this whole thing happened with Yosef, that his son was taken away from him for 20 years. He didn't see his beloved son. That was a big part of that was that he settled in the land instead of sojourning in the land, that his father was commanded to sojourn in the land, and sojourning implies that you're not in your own place. to sojourn, it means to be there temporarily. The Hebrew is gar, which means like an outsider. That he was to sojourn in the land, meaning that to the righteous, this world, Olam Hazeh, this world is to be a temporary place, and our real focus is the world to come. And we should view ourselves as strangers in the land, that we're just here temporarily. Whereas Yaakov wanted to settle there, he wanted to feel at home there, and that's what he was punished for. The second answer that he gives, which is really very similar to this, is that at the covenant between the parts, this is in chapter 16, verse 13, backing up a lot more, where Hashem told Abraham, a minute, someday I'll learn to write down the page numbers. Wasn't even close. Let's see. I'm actually way off with that. Okay, I got it. So it's in chapter 15, verse 13. That's on page 69 in the Art Scroll Chumash, Parshas Lech Lecha. So it says there, and he said to Abraham, Hashem said to Abraham, know with certainty that your offspring shall be aliens in a land not their own, and they will serve them, and they will oppress them 400 years. But also the nation that they will serve I shall judge, and afterwards they will leave with great wealth. So Abraham was told that your offspring shall be aliens. The Hebrew is ger yazaracha, the same word as sojourning. They will sojourn in a land that's not theirs. The commentaries asked, the Gemara asked that how, in what way was this fulfilled? That it's understood that this was referring to our enslavement in Egypt, but we were only in Egypt for 210 years. So what's these 400 years? So our sages say that the 400 years begins from the birth of Yitzchak. And when it says that your offspring will be strangers, will be aliens in a land that was not theirs, that includes from the time that his son Yitzchak was born, that's his offspring, and they were aliens in a land not theirs because Hashem did not give us the land of Canaan yet. It first became ours, really. It became our land as opposed to the land of the Canaanites when we left Egypt. So Yitzchak was a ger for that reason, that he was fulfilling this prophecy of Avram that we would be aliens in a land that's not ours, even when we were in the land of Canaan. But Yaakov, once again, wanted to settle. Yaakov settled in the land. He felt at home there, not an alien, not a stranger. And therefore, that's once again why he was punished with the loss of his son, Yosef, for 20 some odd years. Okay, so now moving on. Okay, so now moving on. So they had, so we said that he treated Yosef better than his other brothers, and made him this coat of many colors, or the fine woolen tunic. And he brought evil reports about his brothers to his father. So in verse 5 on page 201, Yosef dreamt a dream, and he dreamt a dream where he said that we were standing in the middle of the field when my sheaf, that's like my bundle of grain, rose up, and all of your bundles bowed down to my bundle. And in verse 8, his brothers said, would you reign over us? Would you dominate us? And they hated him more because of his dreams and because of his talk. They hated him because he was dreaming these dreams, and they hated him more because he was telling them as if to lord it over them, that to let them know that he felt this was going to happen. And then he dreamt another dream, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. And his father scolded him and said, what is this dream? Do you dream? Are we to come to bow down? So his brothers were jealous, but his father kept the matter at hand. So now on page 203, verse 12, it begins that his father, Yaakov, sent Yosef to check on his brothers that were shepherding the flocks. His brothers get together and say, this dreamer is coming, and they made a decision that it was the right thing to do to kill him. And the commentaries say that they viewed him as a rodif. That's a person that's out to get someone else. Let's say if someone's trying to kill another person, that person is allowed to stand up against them and kill them in self-defense. And they viewed Yosef as a rodif himself. And some of the commentators say the reason why is that they knew that Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Yitzchak, and just Yitzchak was chosen to keep the family legacy of being the people of Hashem, and Ishmael was sent on his own. And then the next generation, Yitzchak, had two sons, Yaakov and Esav, and Yaakov was one who was kept to be the family legacy, and Esav was left out. So they thought that Yosef was angling for the same thing. They thought that Yosef was angling with them when he was bringing evil reports to them, to their father, that he was angling to be the one who would carry on the family legacy, and they would all be left out. And they felt that that itself was being a rodef, to expel them from the Jewish people, and he was deserving of death for that. Or at least that they were allowed to kill him to stop that from happening. In verse 21 on page 203, it says, Reuben heard and he rescued them from their hand. He said, we will not strike him mortally. And Reuben said, shed no blood, throw him into this pit. So Reuben advised that they should, instead of killing him directly, they should throw him in a pit in the wilderness and leave him there and have basically kill him indirectly. And the Torah says that Reuben was really planning on coming back and saving him afterwards. And then in verse 25 on page 205, they sat down to eat food. They raised their eyes and saw, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead. And Yehuda said to his brothers, what gain will there be if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let our hand not be upon him, for he is our brother of flesh. So he said, even rather than kill him indirectly by leaving him in this pit to die, we should sell him as a slave to the Ishmaelites going down to Egypt, and then he'll be taken care of. That being a slave isn't a it's not a career that's conducive towards promotion. And once he's sold as a slave, he'll just be a lowly slave his whole life and won't be able to bother anybody. So that was their plan. And his brothers agreed, and that's what they did. And in verse 29, Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Yosef was not in the pit, so he rent his garments. So Reuben was away, and when they made up this whole idea. So the commentaries ask, the Rabbi Bachya brings this question, that we say on Tisha B'Av and on Yom Kippur, we say a lament for the 10 martyrs. These were 10 of the greatest of the great Tanaim, the great sages of the Mishnah, who were killed by the Romans. And it's understood that they're killed for having, that they were kind of in place of the 10 tribes for having sold their brother Yosef. And why is it 10? So the obvious answer would be that Binyamin wasn't there, and the Binyamin was with his father, he wasn't there, and Yosef was the one who was being sold and he wasn't there. So the commentaries, so the Rabbi Bachya asks that if that was the case, Reuven also shouldn't count, because Reuven wasn't involved in the sale. He involved that he advised to throw him in a pit and let him die on his own, and his plan, and he actually came back to save him from the pit, just he wasn't there, so he wasn't involved in the sale. So why is it 10 martyrs and not 9? And to this, the Rabbeinu Bachya answers that the 10th isn't actually Reuven, the 10th was actually Yosef. And that was Yosef also carried some of the blame for not to exonerate the other brothers, and they were in fact counted as towards the 10. They were punished themselves, but Yosef carried some of the blame because well, by bringing these evil reports about his brothers and causing his brothers' hatred, he was an active participant in this, in causing and bringing this about. He says another answer, the Rabbeinu Bachya brings another answer, that in fact Reuven is the 10th, not Yosef, but he was being punished for a different reason, and that is that he's being punished for what we saw in last week's Parsha, that he got involved in his father's marital life in an inappropriate way, and that's what he was being punished for. And in fact, the Rabbeinu Bachya said that this is hinted at in the blessing that Yosef got. I'm sorry, the blessing that where was I? Oh yeah, the blessing that Reuven got from, I think it was from Moshe, that he said Vihi misav mispar, that he's part of that he's counted as part of the number. And that is that Reuven's counted as one of the 10 who were to be punished as one of the 10 martyrs. But okay. Okay, so whatever, Reuven, he wasn't there, he rent his garments, and Yosef was brought down to Egypt, and Yaakov saw they brought back garments dipped in the blood of an animal and showed it to Yaakov, and Yaakov was devastated and mourned for his son. Okay, so now on page 209, chapter 38, that it was that time that Yehuda went down from his brothers, turned away towards an Adulamite man whose name was Hira, and he married the daughter of a prominent merchant whose name was Shua, and she had 3 sons. She had Onan, and Shelah. Now, in verse 6, Yehuda took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. Died. Onan did Yibum, did perform levirate marriage, but he also died. And all of this was without children. And then Yehuda said now Yehuda was kind of worried that she's a little bit of a black widow. Already 2 of his sons who married her died. So he was concerned about his youngest son, Shelah, and delayed in allowing him to marry her, to perform this levirate marriage. So in verse 12, many days passed, this is on page 209, verse 12, and Shua's daughter, the wife of Yehuda, died. When Yehuda was consoled, he went up to oversee his sheep shearers, he and his Dulamite friend Hira, to Timnah. And on page 211, and Tamar heard about this, and in verse 14, so she removed her widow's garb from upon her, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself up. Then she sat by the crossroads, which is on the road towards Timnah, and she saw that Shelah had grown, and she had not been given to him as a wife. She saw that Yehuda was delaying that. When in verse 15, when Yehuda saw her, he thought her to be a harlot since she had covered her face. The commentaries say either that was the custom of the harlots, they would cover their face so people wouldn't know who they were, or he thought she was a harlot because if her face was uncovered, she would recognize who it was, that it was Tamar. But since her face was covered, he didn't know who she was. And he thought she was a harlot because she was standing at the crossroads. So he detoured to her by the road and said, "Come, if you please, let me consort with you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. So the Medrash says that this was all, he detoured towards her, the Hebrew there. Where am I? That vayet eleha el haderech. It's an interesting expression, and the Medrash says that it's telling us that an angel actually pushed him in that direction, because this was the union that was to bring about the Davidic dynasty, the dynasty of the Jewish people. And Peretz will be born from this union, and he would be the great-grandfather of David HaMelech, of King David. So this union was divinely arranged. Okay, etc. So he left security with her to ensure that he would pay. And then she disappeared. So Yehuda was looking for her to pay her and had to inquire about people. In verse 21, he inquired of the people of her place, "Where is the prostitute, the one of the crossroads by the road?" He asked, "Where is she? Where is she?" And they said, there's no one like that here. So on page 213, and it was when about 3 months had passed that Yehuda was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has committed harlotry, and moreover she is conceived by harlotry," that she's not exactly betrothed to his son Shelah, but there's an obligation on the son Shelah to marry her, so they have some kind of relationship, and she has conceived outside of that relationship. So Yehuda said, "Take her out to let her be burned." And as she was taken out, she said word to her father-in-law, saying, "Be the man to whom these belonged with, I am with child. It's this person's child that I'm pregnant with." And she said, "Identify, if you please, whose are the signet, this wrap, and the staff." Yehuda recognized and said, "She is right. It is from me, inasmuch as I did not give her to Shelah, my son," and he was not intimate with her anymore. But it's telling us that Yehuda could have kept quiet and nobody would have known. But he spoke up and was willing to take on all the shame that entailed to do what was right. And I say this is one of the reasons that Yehuda is the one who was chosen to be the king, to be the ancestor of the kings, that the kings would come from Yehuda, because this is a trait of the tribe of Yehuda, that they're willing to do what's right, in spite of the fact that it's hard and it's might be shameful.
It was the first time we heard of Ibum.
Yes, so this is the first time I think that we see Yibum in the Torah, and the commentaries say that this isn't a proper Yibum with Yehuda. With the brothers, it actually would be, but with Yehuda, Yehuda isn't a brother; he is actually a father-in-law, and they say that in fact, before the Torah was given, the custom was that it was the close relatives. It wasn't necessarily the brother who would do Yibum. It was the close relatives of the one who passed away. And once the Torah was given, it was codified as specifically the brother, not anyone else. Oh, 1 second. I didn't realize that. Okay, I made the same mistake as last time when I was here. I think we should be good now. Second. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Okay, so she gave birth. There were twins in her womb. It happened, the midwife, and in verse 28 on page 213, states, and it happened as she gave birth, one put out his hand, the midwife took a crimson thread and tied it on his hand, saying, this one emerged first. And it was as he drew back his hand that behold, his brother emerged. So one stuck out his arm. They put a string around to show which one's the firstborn. And then the other one came out first. And she said, with what strength have you asserted yourself? And she called his name Paris, which means like a breach. Not breach like a breech baby, but breach means like making an opening. And afterwards, his brother, in whose hand was a crimson thread, came out. She called his name Zara. And our sages say that a melech poritz geder, that a king will make his own hole in a fence. That a king doesn't need a gate to come through. The king comes through wherever he wants to come through. And this was a sign that Peretz was to be the ancestor of the kings of King David. Okay, and this introduction to this section began back on page 209. It was at that time that Yehuda went down from his brothers. So the Medrash asks, what does it mean that it was at that time? What's specific about that time? So our sages say that what was going on in that moment. So Yosef was in mourning. Yosef was crying. He was being sold as a slave, being carried down by a caravan, sold as a slave. Yaakov was crying in mourning for his beloved son Yosef. And so what was Hashem doing in that moment? So Hashem was arranging our Redeemer, and the commentaries explain that this was really the beginning of our first exile to Egypt, that Yosef being sent to Egypt was the first step in the chain of events that brought the Jewish people there and made us slaves in Egypt. So at this point, what's Hashem doing as our exile as the chain of events leading to our exile is starting? Hashem's arranging our final redemption and arranging the birth of King David and ultimately the birth of Mashiach. So as we're getting ready to go into exile the first time, Hashem is creating already our Redeemer. Okay, so it continues. Yosef ended up being brought down to Egypt, and he became a slave of Potiphar, the chamberlain of butchers. Some of the commentaries say, in fact, that butcher in this case means like an executioner, and that's why we'll see later he was the one in charge of the jail. But he became very successful, and he ended up running the whole household. Potiphar's wife desired Yosef, and she tried to seduce him, and when that didn't work, so he ran away from her, and she was left holding his garment, and she slandered him and said that, in fact, that he was trying to seduce her, and had grabbed her and then ran away when someone came. And so he was thrown into prison. And that's on page 217, verse 19. And it was when his master had his wife's words that she slandered him, said he tried to force me. So Yosef's master took him, placed him in the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he remained there in prison. And once again, he found favor in the eyes of everyone there and ended up really running the prison. So at that time, the king's cupbearer and the king's baker transgressed against the king of Egypt, and they were thrown in the same jail. Sages say that there was a fly in the king's wine, and there was a pebble in the king's bread. So they got thrown into the prison. And they were there for a long period, and then each of them had
baker and candlestick maker.
Oh, but they somehow didn't make it in. So they each had a dream. The butcher dreamt, as it says on page 219. So where am I? In verse 9, the chamberlain of the cupbearers recounted his dream to Yosef. This is on page 219, verse 9. And said to him, in my dream, behold, there was a grapevine. In front of me on the grapevine were 3 tendrils, and it was as though it budded, its blossoms bloomed, its clusters ripened into grapes. And the Paro's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes, pressed them into Paro's cup, and I placed the cup on Paro's palms. And Yosef said that this is to tell you that in 3 days' time, you'll be returned to your former post, and you'll be bringing wine to Paro. When the baker heard this, he was all excited. And if he's he got such a great interpretation, so he, on page 221, verse 16, the chamberlain of the bakers saw that he interpreted well. So he said to Yosef, I too in my dream, behold, 3 wicker baskets were on my head, and the uppermost basket were all kinds of Paro's food, baker's handiwork, and the birds were eating them from the basket above my head. Yosef responded and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Paro will lift your head from you and hang you on a tree. Birds will eat your flesh from you. Also, not a very nice report. It was on the 3rd day, Paro's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he counted the chamberlain of the cupbearers and chamberlain of bakers among his servants. So he restored the chamberlain of cupbearers to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup in Paro's palm, but he hanged the chamberlain of bakers just as Yosef had interpreted them. In verse 23, yet the chamberlain of the cupbearers did not remember Yosef, but forgot him, for Yosef asked them to mention him to Paro to try to get him free, but once he was free, he forgot about Yosef. Okay, shkoyach, have a great Shabbos.